Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Wizards at War, Chapter 15, Armistice. In this chapter, we're saying goodbye to the young wizard's world, at least for Spoil Me. But there are a lot of things that are being set up here, and I'm very interested personally to see where they go. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Yama for commissioning this episode. So those of you who may be keeping track have noticed probably how far apart episodes have been. And it's really hard to get bookings. I recognize that because I am booked up a lot. But Young Wizards in particular has been one that has flagged. People who want me to cover it have been like really intense about it, but they aren't able to always like afford it or get a spot. And I have to give priority to stuff that can be fully pre-booked as like a big, so those tend to edge out things that are getting piecemeal commissioned. And finally it reached a point with Young Wizards that I just couldn't keep it on the roster anymore, because I don't think it's as satisfying to listen to my coverage if there's that much space and I forget a ton of what was going on in the book by the time I get to the next chapter. Basically, I have this sort of like in place as a limit, and that is meant to keep this interesting for people listening. And it's not as much fun if you're frustrated by the fact that there's a character I don't remember or a plot thread that I've completely forgotten about and am not considering when I predict things. So, it's like a bummer because I've been really enjoying these books. And I mentioned this in the post that I made for this episode. I intend to read the remaining two. There's Wizards on Mars, and then I can't remember the title for the last book. I am going to try and listen to the audiobooks for those on my own time and like share thoughts in a thread on Discord. There's a channel for Discord called Books, and I try to make like a thread when I'm wanting to specifically talk about something, and rather than like taking over the main channel. So I don't know when I'm going to start the book after this, but I just wanted to let folks know to keep an eye on that if you're interested in hearing my thoughts on the remaining two books in the series. Yama says, I'm in the middle of a drive, so I don't know how my connection will be. Oh, you're still here, though. That is commitment. I honestly think you've done an amazing job with this series. You remember things I would never. Oh, well, thank you. That really does, that does mean a lot, because sometimes I feel like I am just fumbling around and look like, why are people paying you to talk about this? You know what I mean? Just how spaced they are, it would be impossible to me. Yeah, it's the thing that really gets tricky is when something is spaced out and I'm also covering literally 7 other properties at the same time. That's when it starts to be really difficult, because, I say 7 and it's actually more than that, but roughly 7 at any given time. And so that is when it starts to get a little tricky. You start to conflate certain character names or some storylines that might be a little similar and just lose it, But I did want to address, like, I've really liked this series. I'm not canceling because it's a problem with the writing or the series itself. It's just the way that the commissions wound up. So if anybody out there wants to commission like the entire book, next book in bulk, get in touch with me. If you don't see me like talking about listening to the audiobooks in the Discord, probably I haven't started them yet. And you're more than welcome. Like, I would be willing to do a full booking ahead of time. And I actually have space now because there are some other things that have ended. So that's a possibility. But the way that it's been, which was various people at various times all commissioning as they could, that was the thing. It just didn't have quite as much support. Like, One Piece is also like that, but the fandom is so big and so committed with that there is somebody booking an episode every week, twice a week sometimes, and there just wasn't quite that same like size of fandom, I guess, for this series. And that happens. What can you do? Not everything that deserves a big fandom gets it. And that's one of those just things in life that I am also trying to come to terms with. As somebody who has a bit of a fandom, it's always sort of like, yeah, but more though, please. I wonder about Diane Duane's attitude about this as well. I haven't tried to like look into her too much because I didn't want to spoil myself. Sometimes you'll like stumble across something in the author's own tweet and you're like, fuck. So I've just been avoiding anything to do with her. But yeah, I am sad that the last episode of coverage is a chapter where so many things feel like they're being set up in this particular way, because it seems interesting to me. Other books have ended, and it's not that things weren't set up. It's just there felt like there was more closure than in this book. There was certainly some, but obviously we've got a lot of loose threads, and I don't feel like this was the vibe at the end of the other books. So it's just a shame that it has to happen here. Yama says, noted. I just got a job starting next month, so maybe. All right, no pressure, but putting it out there. And congratulations on the job. Yay. So, okay. Armistice is the name of chapter 15. And it starts off, it was, of course, not so simple. There was, first of all, the matter of Ronan. I want to mention, in the chat, before I started recording, Jacob came in and left some comments. He said that he wasn't going to be able to make the actual recording, but he wanted to leave some info. And he asks first, any overall thoughts about the series so far? And what situations would you like to see each of our heroes face? And I'm going to talk about those after I finish the actual chapter coverage. Then he drops, I think someone mentioned before that Tom and Carl are based on two of Diane Duane's friends. They've both passed away, and her husband posted a picture of each of them, and he links that. And honestly, I don't know why, but Tom and Carl looked pretty much just like I pictured, and I have no reason to have pictured them this way, but they're older than I was imagining. I was seeing them in my head as like maybe like around 40, and these guys look like they're probably in their late 50s, but which they died young, it seems like. But yeah, it was wild when I saw their pictures. I was like, oh yeah, that's Tom and Carl. And I don't know if that's a product of her writing somehow, but damn. And then Jacob links on a lighter note, this is how she pictures Ronan. And it's he says this is a CGI model she's looking at for future book covers. The model would probably be aged down a little. And it's a Tumblr post, because Diane Duane has a Tumblr, which I think is amazing. And first of all, Ronan could get it. I've been right. I knew I was right. But yes, I think this CGI model might even be a little too pretty. I feel like Ronan needs a little bit like less symmetrical features, but it's pretty rad. So if anybody's interested, the Crowdcast last episode has these links if you want to check them out. But it's interesting, and this is not, I'm not criticizing you, Jacob, but the fact that this is potential future book covers means to me that Ronan survives and does some pretty important shit later. And I'm interested in that. There's only according to what I have read, 2 remaining Young Wizards books. But then there was a couple of things mentioned in the post with Ronan's CGI model, and it's set in the same universe and everything. So I'm really interested in what direction she's taking there, because Diane Duane is prolific. She's writing a lot of stuff, and I'm just sort of curious about other things that she's done. Let's see. Agreed. Tom and Carl are exactly like that. And Ronan, yes. Yeah. And this is the sort of thing that because I have a really hard time, depending on the property, picturing characters at times. It can be very tricky, especially if somebody is written as having sort of qualities that seem to contradict one another. So like Lyndon in Cradle is huge and sort of glowering, but he's also meant to have a really humble, like deferential attitude. And keeping that in mind, it was so hard. And then I saw a couple of like animations and illustrations, and I was like, okay, thank you for resolving that, because I was having a hell of a time trying to put those 2 things together in my head. Anyway, okay. So Ronan is saved, and I told you guys that I really could go either way on how I felt about Ronan, whether he recovered or not. And I stand by that. If he had died, it would have been a huge bummer, because I really liked him as a character. But I also would have respected there needing to be a sacrifice, something that was like very significant. There are times when a character surviving, when it seems very much like they are dead, there are times where that can come across as feeling really cheap. And I don't feel that way about this. It does feel a little bit easy, because he is like basically magically healed. And that's not to say that he's totally fine, but he recovers quite a bit pretty quickly. However, the fact is that the one in him who used the spear purposely aimed for a particular spot that wouldn't kill him. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I think it is surprising that he got to choose to do that, because I really would have thought that like the death of the host was sort of a requirement to it being freed. And it seems like that was optional, and the host just had to be willing to die. That was like in the fine print or something, But again, I just don't have a problem with that. And there is a wizard from Australia named Matt, and he comes over, and he is described as, I'm trying to find the spot. Here it is. A spiky-haired 15-year-old boy in floppy surfer shorts and a jean jacket. That combo. I'm also, full disclosure, picturing him straight up, no shirt, only a jean jacket, and like flip-flops. That's my image. And that is amazing. And I really hope that he comes back. I hope that he's named here, because we're going to meet him again. Nita recognizes him. So she has met him already. He is already like technically a recurring character. But the fact that he can heal like this feels huge. Like, this isn't out of the question. We know that this power is out there, but it is just not something that our particular little crew, or the people who have been added to the crew over time, none of them have had this particular gift. So it's interesting to see somebody who is this good at it. And he has an Australian accent. So let's see. It was a little longer than no time, because he says he'll be better in no time. And Matt looked a little pale by the time it was over. But 15 minutes or so later, Ronan lay breathing quietly, and Matt was sitting in the moon dust getting his breath back, his own wounds closing up. Like most healing wizardries, this one had needed blood. Which I was glad that this was mentioned, because I completely forgot about how that was an aspect of this. And there's just something about needing to do something like give of yourself in a very physical way to heal that makes a great deal of sense to me, you know? So Dairine, they're trying to figure out what to do with him because he's still unconscious. And Matt says, we need to let him have some hours of rest. And Dairine says he can be in my room. I have some things to take care of. And Nita looks at her because Dairine, when she says this, is so emotionless that it's alarming. She's just like, man, are you okay? And the answer is no. No, she is not okay. And I really appreciate how much space Nita gives her. She doesn't push trying to, like, you know, connect with her, be like, I'm so sorry, any of that. And I think some of it is due to the fact that they are not totally certain he's dead. Even by the end of this chapter, the implication seems to be that he is not, but I am not certain what the implication is either. So Matt says, get in touch in a couple days. I want to do a follow-up with him. And then he takes off. And they all head back. And there's a moment of Nita just looking at her yard and how utterly ordinary it is and that she can't believe it. And that is some real shit. Dairine nodded and went ahead of them very quietly, unlocking the back door and vanishing into the house. Carmela glanced at Kit, then started after her. Nita put out a hand. Let her go, she said. Mela, maybe this is a job for you. Want to check on Scarrett? Carmela nodded and roughed up the top of Kit's hair before he was able to do anything about it. I'll go tell Mama and Pop that we're home, she said, and that you're a hero. Spare me, Kit said, but Carmela was already trotting down the driveway. So they're heading inside. They take a moment to look up at the moon, which, reminder, they were literally just standing on, and noting how wild it is that everything that just happened did, and yet down here it feels so ordinary. And her dad is inside and tells her that basically all of these powers were looking at each other ready to launch nuclear missiles or whatever. And then all of them seemed to come to their senses at the exact same moment. And he says that would have been about the time that every dog in town started to howl. It wasn't just here either. Dogs all over the state, possibly all over the country. There are as many theories as there are news channels that are bothering to carry the story. The main theory seems to be the government was testing some new kind of sound weapon or early warning systems. And when she says paunch, she says, yeah, I thought maybe because all the other governments on the planet seem to have been testing the same weapon. And then just is like, just tell me about it later. But this is the kind of thing that I am always really interested in, the phenomenon of magic bleeding into the ordinary world and the way people decide to explain it away. And sometimes it feels like there's a perfectly like reasonable way to do that. And then there's something like this, and I do not know what the hell you say to people worldwide that all experienced this, because with the internet, it's not going to be long until everybody begins commiserating and realizing it happened everywhere. How do you explain something like that? The theories that will sprout up from this, like in the present day real world, it takes so little to get a conspiracy theory started. It takes genuinely nothing. People will just formulate shit out of nowhere. But something that big and that widespread, I mean, can you imagine what people are going to make out of that? It's going to be impossible. I would love to be a little bit more immersed in the, like, ordinary part of this world to see how folks are trying to process what's going on. This is also something that has come up for me in the Dresden Files. The final book, and spoilers for Dresden Files, But the final book that we have read recently, Battleground, there is a massive attack on Chicago that results in the death of tens of thousands of people. And it is a magical attack from a giant being walking through Godzilla style, zapping buildings, and armies of otherworldly creatures coming in and like eating infants and shit. And the way in which they explain it is, we're seeing it like usually from Harry's perspective. And because he knows what really happened, the explanations feel so silly. But I would love to be in the shoes of an ordinary vanilla mortal in that universe and get to see from their side what they remember of the attack and how it's being explained when they either ask questions about it, or maybe they don't ask questions because they don't want to know and they're explaining it away to themselves, or what. Because that's something that I have always found really fascinating. And I talked about this in an episode of Full Metal Alchemist earlier this week. The way that human beings can lie to themselves, that is something that I don't think any other being engages in. We deceive ourselves in a way that is truly effective, in a frightening way. And the reasons why we'll do it, sometimes they're very valid and it's like a self-protection sort of thing. Sometimes it's just because we don't want to think differently than we have been. And it's very uncomfortable and challenging to change up things that we have believed. And sometimes it's straight up scary. And there's an aspect of it that's like, well, if I don't lie to myself and I face what I saw, there's also still nothing I can do about that. So lying to myself is just as effective than being honest. Like, there's no plus to honesty, because I am completely helpless in this scenario either way. So I may as well lie to myself, because that makes the helplessness feel a lot less threatening. And I truly get that. As somebody who hates helplessness, I am a control freak. The temptation to lie to yourself to make things feel like they are more within your control, that is probably the single most, in my mind, damaging deception that human beings engage in, especially I would say in the United States. Because we just love this whole narrative that if you just try hard enough, you're going to be able to pull yourself out of any bad situation that you're in. And people want to believe that because we want to think, no matter what happens to us, that we have some control over the situation. And it's just not true, but we hate that, as we should, because it doesn't have to be that way. But as long as you can fool yourself into thinking anybody could just do it if they try hard enough, you don't have to actually address the social structures and safety nets that you could be putting in place to help. You could just blame people individually for it. Anyway, I'm sorry. I know that I always get off on these tangents, guys. I'm so sorry. I'm not sorry. I'm lying to you. But I recognize that it may be frustrating to some of you. The one thing that I will say to sort of wrap up this line of thinking is that there was a thread on Twitter where somebody who had quite a lot of followers, so it blew up, asked the question, if you found yourself on the street with no home, no car, no phone, no money, and none of the connections that you have right now to friends or family, how would you get out of it? And it was remarkable how completely disconnected from reality people were when they answered this question. They had all of these little fantasies about situations without considering any of the realities. It was like people were talking about how they would just go get a job at a fast food restaurant and stay at a homeless shelter until they worked their way up and could afford rent, without thinking about how you need an address to be able to get a job. They don't hire you if you don't have a permanent address. And people are like, well, I'll just use the homeless shelter address. They don't let you do that. What? No, that's not a thing. And also, they were talking about homeless shelters. Like, you can just move in and leave your shit there. Like, it's a hostel or like apartments. They don't get, like, you have to be approved to come in, and you get like 8 hours to sleep, and then you have to be out, and they clean it up, and you don't leave any of your stuff. And people are talking in the comments. I love your tangents. Yeah, tangents are the best. Okay, I'm going to go off a little bit more then. Just a tiny bit, I swear. I'm coming back. But the overall misconception about how homeless shelters work was one of the big ones. Truly, people just don't know how that functions, and think that it's like a permanent residence sort of deal that you can set up. And that's super not how it works, first of all. And secondly, even if it were, they are overrun. There are not nearly enough of them. So the idea that you could just go stay at a homeless shelter is in itself an obstacle. That is not necessarily going to happen for you, getting approved to stay. And then the thing that I found the scariest that people were pointing out, that I was like, I know I've read about this, but I had put it out of my head because I actually was scared by the thought of this. When cops decide to come through and tear down the settlements that homeless people make, where they begin to like amass either like a sort of tent structure, or they keep a lot of their belongings there, cops will destroy everything just for the shit of it, just because they're awful. ACAB forever. And a lot of the property that they destroy is either clothing that can be used to make yourself more presentable for a job interview, so they are forced to wear whatever it is that they have on their back forever. It is money that they may have like saved from busking, doing whatever. Their money is just gone. Or, scariest to me, any documentation proving you are who you say you are. If you want a birth certificate, you need to have an ID to prove that you are who you say to get your birth certificate. But to get an ID, you need to have a birth certificate to prove that you are who you say you are. Social Security cards, anything like that. Imagine having no connections and also not having any paperwork to prove that you are who you say. Where do you start? What do you do when you've got no resources and everything costs money, first of all, and secondly, requires the very kinds of supporting identification that you don't have? And that was where I started to go in sort of a tailspin in my head and had a moment of like, holy shit. Like, all of us are on this knife's edge of being in these positions, and we don't want to admit it because it's super scary, and I get that, but also fucking get over it and let's talk about it, guys. Yama says, dude, documents are so important. Being a foreigner, you don't even know how paranoid I am about keeping my passport safe, because like before we went on our honeymoon to Antigua, we made copies of our passport and put like a copy in every bag and in our carry-on. Like, the best thing that you can do is have copies of copies to at least have something. But again, if cops are gonna do what they do because they're horrible, you're left with no way to prove anything. And I genuinely don't know how one gets out of that hole. I really don't. And I'm sure there's ways, but I haven't looked into it. It was just like the concept of being that unmoored from like the societal structure that you have to start that from scratch, that I had a moment of just like almost vertigo. You know what I'm saying? Anyway. Okay. I'm coming back, I swear. So they get Ronan upstairs. He winds up waking up like fairly quickly, actually. And he makes a joke to Nita about the zit on her face. Ronan, stop it. Oh my God, I was so mad at him for that, truly. But it also was funny, I'm not going to lie. And they have both been told by their father that they have to start school the next day. And this is one of the threads that I completely forgot about until it was put up here. And I was like, right, this whole thing with like attendance and Dairine being like really difficult about it, and completely had forgotten all about this. But what Nita thinks made a lot of sense to me, and she has this immediate like reaction of, oh God, no, I need another day, come on. And then she sort of stops and is like, actually, having just a normal day at school might help make this all feel a little bit less insane. And I really was like, that's a good point. You know, sometimes you just continuing on is better than being at loose ends with all this free time and nothing to do but think about the thing. And that's part of why I have often reacted to like grief and upset by burying myself in work. It's tried and true method. I say tried and true. I mean, true asterisk. It works for a little bit. It's not the way, but you know. So, and he also asks about where Roshaun is, and they kind of have to be like, we'll tell you about all of that later. And let's see. I couldn't go anywhere the way you were yelling at me. Don't think I didn't hear you. He says that to Nita, which I think is really fun because that's what she was doing, reminder, when she like kind of used magic to keep him from leaving his body, was literally just screaming at him not to go. And the idea that he wakes up and is like, oh my God, you were so loud. That is very amusing to me. And he says about him in capital letters, the one who was occupying him. If I'd known I'd be rid of him so soon, maybe I'd have appreciated him more. But you didn't know, Nita said. You thought he was going to be in there forever. He knew, though. This is Ronan. That much I gathered as he was leaving. And he was just after gathering that spear. It hadn't been forged for me or for him. It was always forged for her, for the Hesper, even when the smith of Phaleus first made it 10,000 years ago. And I thought I was just a spear carrier, so was he. He thought it was a stitch. You should have heard him laughing. I did. I mentioned about his sense of humor, Nita said, and rubbed one ear in memory of having been bitten there by the Defender long ago. And he says the whole bloody thing was a setup. The Hesper'd never have broken loose all the way, unless the lone one was there to try to stop her. If it had just ignored her, none of this would ever have happened. But that was how they had it planned. And I really like this because you guys know, if you've listened to other shows of mine, that sometimes a thing that's like sort of prophesied or predestined can feel a little bit lazy. And the idea that the big bad in the situation has to make a choice that triggers things to start falling into place, I find that a lot more like rich. I feel like it adds a nice dimension, because otherwise it's too much like the characters being moved around like pieces on a playing board. But if somebody has to engage and choose to be at a certain place, or like, forgive me, but Voldemort choosing Harry instead of Neville, for example, I always like the idea that they started things down the road to their own destruction because they chose in a certain way and didn't realize at the time that that was like part of it, you know? So yeah. So Nita paused just long enough to take the shower she'd been desperately longing for and change her clothes. About half an hour later, pausing only to stop in at a shop in the little strip mall on the way, she and Kit were standing on Tom and Carl's doorstep. Now, I will tell you what, guys. This was 2 sentences, and when it got to half an hour pausing only to stop in at a shop in a little strip mall on the way, I was genuinely like, are you serious? You guys just got back from like one of the most traumatic battles on the fucking moon, watching a friend possibly die. You got back and find out you have to go to school tomorrow, and you're going running errands now? I was just like, go to bed. And then it ends with they're at Tom and Carl's doorstep, and I'm like, fuck, okay, yeah, they gotta go see Tom and Carl. Okay, fine. I just really had a moment here of just, y'all are pushing it too hard. But considering the way they last saw Tom and Carl, like, obviously they're going to be extremely worried about these two, so I can't be mad at them for this. There's a moment when Tom opens the door and they don't say anything, and it's very nerve-wracking. And finally he says, we are on errantry, and boy, do we ever greet you. And they have this like amazing hug moment of just thank God. And Nita has brought a container of mealworms for Akeken-sama. I am hoping I'm saying that right. Tell him I owe him one. Her, Carl said. Are you guys okay now? Kit said. If okay includes being tragically embarrassed, yes, but we couldn't help it any more than any other adult wizard on the planet could. I remember saying exactly what I said, and I believed it. It was terrible. Carl was nodding. He ran his fingers through his hair. Imagine not doing anything but work for the TV station. He shuddered. It was a nightmare. Thank the one there's more to life. And that was a moment of me just kind of being like, I feel like that was a bit of shade. Look, I'm not saying it's like real mean-spirited shade, but there was a feeling there of just like, you better have more going on than just your job, because honestly, like, what are you doing? And there's a part of me that prickles at that, because especially lately, there's been such a pushback, rightfully, on the idea that like what you do for a living is your entire identity, and that we value productivity and things that can be monetized above anything else. So a part of me is like understanding, yeah, there needs to be more to life, but also defensive. Like, yeah, well, it's easy to say that if you don't already have to work like 3 jobs in order to cover your expenses. And then I was just like, it's not that deep, Tosh. But there are moments where I start to get very in my feelings about stuff, which is really kind of funny because I am no longer in the position that I had been. So I am part of like a very privileged sector at this point in my life, working from home, able to set my own schedule, all of that. And I recognize that, but I just very acutely remember what it used to be like. And that was the worst. And I didn't even have it as bad as a lot of people do. And I don't have children on top of it. Anyway, so Kit says, so it's over. And Tom says, I very much doubt that. And both of them have the same moment of just like, oh my God, are you serious? It's going to happen again. And finally, Nita says, no, it's not going to do that again. The whole reason for the Polulus was to keep anyone from helping the Hesper wake up. It's too late for that now, and the lone one won't waste so much energy again on an attack. This was a one-off. And she says this, and Carl is like, is that precog? And she sort of stops and says, I don't know. And I thought this was really interesting that she has this moment that seems like just her starting an argument. Not when I say starting an argument, it makes it sound like she's being argumentative. More like she's making a declarative statement that she's going to back up with evidence. But she doesn't back it up with evidence, really. She just says what she thinks, and it feels really conversational. And I assumed that this was regular Nita. But then when he asks, she truly doesn't know, which means that her whole precog thing is a lot more in play in regular conversation in a subtle, casual way that I was thinking. I'm assuming, it's going to be this big dramatic Trelawney thing where she begins speaking in a different voice and freezes up or tremors or whatever. And no, it's just something that she sort of says. And when he pushes her, she realizes that she doesn't really know where it came from. And I kind of like that. There's something about it that feels like it's subtle enough that if it happens in the midst of a conversation with a regular person, it won't draw a particular attention to her. And because of like the way that these kids have to live with what they can do, anything that feels a little bit less noticeable, I am going to feel more comfortable with. I just want them to be safe. Every time that it's maybe going to blow their cover, I get very nervous. So I just thought that this was an interesting way for this to manifest. And he says, you better start keeping an eye on what you say. You started your ordeal with a precognitive event, as I remember. At the time, I wondered if that was going to be something that would develop in more detail later on. Looks like I was right. You may be changing specialties again. Better get back to your manual studies and make sure. And Nita says, just when I thought things might get quiet and stay the same for a while. If that isn't an entire mood. Y'all. I mean, honestly. And he says, the only part of this job that's the same for life is that everything is subject to change without notice. And this is one of those things that I know to be true. I recognize this intellectually, but, it's so inconvenient. Like, it's part of the joy of life. It's inconvenient, but also, like, if everything stayed the same, how awful would that be? But you know what I'm saying. Sometimes you just feel like you want to fucking break. She's tired, like Christ. And Carl says, there was an interesting development associated with that burnout. It seems to have duplicated itself on a smaller scale in the neighborhood of Rearhath B. They burned clean about the same time we did, the manual says. And Kit says, probably someone saying thank you for all the blue food. Carmela told us about that when she got back from checking on Scarrett. I am not recalling what this is about. If anybody wants to fill me in, feel free, because this was something I genuinely was like, I know that the blue food was a thing in like the crossings, and that was like a favorite. Was that a favorite of Scarrett specifically? Or I'm just like, I feel like I've got a very tenuous sort of memory of it, and it's not solidifying for me. Mordecai says, members, it was specifically about the TV station. Oh, we're talking about, yeah. And Yama says, of Punch, wasn't it? Oh, Punch. Right. Punch liked blue food. Okay. Yeah, I completely forgot about that. So he was doing them a favor because okay, I see what you're saying. All right. And they found the master. Scarrett found him and the crossing staff on some little ice planet orbiting a brown dwarf in the Lesser Magellanic. I think the Tawalf and their masters had some idea that they might use them as hostages or hold them for ransom if the attack didn't go as planned. They were all suffering from exposure, but Rearhaid are tough. They'll recover in a few months. Scarrett will be master for the time being. So, also, the Tawalf are the ones that started that attack that Carmela stepped in and saved them from, right? In the crossings itself. So then Carl says, well, we've come through with not that much damage. Not that in other times and places the lone power won't attack in ways that are as awful locally, but that doesn't change the fact that this was a victory of a kind we may never see again in our lifetimes. And when Kit says, is it true we're going to see more birds of the Hesper and each one will get stronger? Carl says it seems likely. But the powers, like the One, are cagey about their scheduling. They're not going to give anything away that will make it easier for the lone power to derail what they've got planned. And I was like, yeah, that's a good policy. Don't go out here making declarations about shit. It's not smart. So then there's this moment here where Kit says, we won. And Carl says, we always win because what we do, they do. Not the other way around, Nita said. Tom shook his head. It's a popular misconception. And I really like that in particular. The idea that we do things in imitation of the powers rather than what we do being what forms the direction the powers move. That makes things feel more significant, makes what we do feel more important. And I know that there is a lot out there about if people don't continue to have a belief in a God, that God will fade away. So there's a lot of media where a God is sort of resurrected by a community of believers and worshipers being like growing and creating almost enough like battery power to like get this being back into its position of power that it used to enjoy. And this is sort of like that, but in a much less passive way. It's not about just worship in a general boring sense. It's about the actual actions you take and the repercussions of that and ripple effects of that. And I think that is a way cooler way of looking at it. And this is sort of the thing that I always talk about, like when I know a lot of people do not believe in astrology, and that is completely fine. But a lot of the reasoning behind a lot of people I've talked to personally, including Owen, who don't believe, is that they interpret it as we are doing XYZ because the planets are doing this. And I have always thought of it as the position of the planets is telling us what is happening. They are not dictating what is happening. They are a reflection of what we are choosing to do here. And they are just sort of like the dictation of the event, not actually in charge of making a thing happen at all. It's not like, I feel like people have it backward. And why the position of certain planets should be a reflection of what we're doing, that's really the question. I don't know. Why anything? Like, honestly, when you just get down to the whys of things, nothing makes any sense. And that's where you start to sort of just spin in circles. But I don't feel like the concept that the movement of planets within a certain solar system reflecting what's going on with conscious beings within that solar system is that outrageous. That kind of makes its own sense to me, you know? So anyway, I like the idea of us assigning the direction of intent and cause and effect in the wrong direction and then realizing like, oh, we had that shit backwards. My bad. So let's see. I'm trying to find the next spot to pick it up. Oh, right. This is when Nita starts thinking about the fact that she doesn't have the voice in her head from the paradexis. But it does come back, I think, when she's dreaming later. And I thought that was sort of interesting. But the scene with Kit and Carl and her and Tom says, you did good, but you know that. And Kit says, yeah, I just wish it didn't hurt so much. And I really appreciated that. You know, victory is not always just a straight up positive. It's very rarely, honestly, a straight up positive. There's a lot of mixtures of things going on there. So then we go to Dairine. And this was interesting. She actually goes to Roshaun's planet. And she's wearing her own clothes and just sort of thinking to herself how if she didn't head straight over here, she'd have lost her nerve, and she knows it. So she's going to have this incredibly difficult conversation before she loses her cool. And his parents know why she's there immediately. The fact that she's by herself, it's just a given. And both of his parents are really struggling to keep their cool. And out of almost like a respect for them and the control they're displaying, she is really trying to keep a lid on her own emotions, but it's hard for her to get through this conversation. And they ask about where it happened and all of this. And then she finally takes out the collar that has that sunstone on it that had lost all its color. It went clear. And she's saying, take this to his father. And he looks at it and says, I will not wear it again. I think it's yours now, for look. She looked at it. The stone had been clear. Now it had a much lighter gold. It did that before, she said. It's a sign of the mastery passing to another. It seems to have become attuned to another star. Mine, Dairine said. Ours is this color. There was a long pause. Roshaun's father reached out to the stone and then pulled his hand back. It is still active, he said. There are some routines that you should learn. He would have wanted to know that its power was not wasted, that it was safe with one he had. Roshaun's father broke off, that he thought worthy of his attention. Some of those usages you could be taught with proper supervision. There'll be nothing but time now. He gazed down at Dairine and reached out a hesitant hand to touch the necklace that just showed under the collar of her shirt. There, around her neck where it would stay, was the fat, round, gleaming emerald threaded on a single sentence in the speech. It was not until a little earlier, when Dairine had had a moment by herself, that she'd had time to read what that sentence was. She was determined not to think about it now. She'd just cry again. I hate this so much. I'm assuming it's something about how he loves her. I don't know. And maybe it's not. But this is just really rude, Diane. Can I call you Diane? Rude. Go to your room. We can teach you so you can guarantee the safety of another world as he guaranteed his. Another star. Thank you, Dairine said. She was controlling herself very tightly, for right now, more than anything, she wanted to say to them, even to shout at them, stop talking about him in the past tense as if he's... But she couldn't say it. Part of her was certain she was deluding herself. The thought, you're just in denial, was already coming up. To say out loud what she really believed would merely guarantee that other people would think she was in denial too. But I can't believe it yet. I can't say anything until I'm sure. Not until I've made that one last test. So she goes home and goes to sleep with it in her hand. And goes to this place. The place through which she moved was one of light, and gathered around her was a huge crowd of inhuman shapes, mostly little and low-built. Shelled in light, they moved through a gigantic construction of fire that towered above and around them. Under them, as a floor, lay a spell diagram of incredible complexity, seemingly miles wide, a plane over which the low, shelled creatures moved casually while the uppermost fires of a star roiled and burned beneath them. Dairine walked out over that wide floor of wizardry, and many of the shelled shapes accompanied her. You're not supposed to be here just yet, one of them said. Neither are you. You're all still alive. Don't mistake this for Time Heart, Logo said. This is just an answer room, a portal area. But you brought us the data that made what's going to happen here possible. Causality therefore becomes something less than an issue. I have no idea what this means. I know that they got an upgrade. This planet, I don't even know what the name of this planet is, if it has one. But with all the beings that Dairine created in her ordeal. So basically what they're saying is that they have ascended to almost beings of energy and not matter, or more energy than matter, maybe some matter remaining. Everywhere it can, the universe breaks the rules, sometimes in the strangest ways. That's what wizardry's about, isn't it? Finding unexpected ways to foil the force that invented death. Doing what life itself does every chance it can. You've put the tools in our hands, and now the possibilities are endless. Let's see how endless, she said. Show me what I came to see. So it's like they are creating an in-between place for beings like Roshaun who have gone through. I'm not clear on what's happening here. She winds up in this like place that is modeled as his rooms at home, but they're not. They're like a perfected version of his rooms at home, his ideal of what they would be. And she's looking for him and keeps thinking that she's going to turn a corner and he's going to be there. And he's nowhere. And eventually she finds a portal in one of the rooms. And when she steps through it, she winds up in her own backyard. Behind her, Logos, silvered by that same moonlight, looked out across the strange place, the image of a time heart within a time heart. Now do you understand? Yes, Dairine said softly. We still have unfinished business. So the backyard that she's in is an idealized version of her own yard? It's not her actual yard? I'm not getting it, and I'm so sorry, but I'm not. Because what it felt like was he found a way out of this sort of in-between place to see her again. But I'm wondering if it's supposed to be there is an in-between place waiting for her and she can meet him there. So he's gone from the planet, like he's died in a way, but he's not gone. That's my interpretation, but I'm not entirely certain I'm getting this right. And I'm not really sure if I'm supposed to get it. I feel like I'm supposed to get it. It's moments like this where I'm like, these books are for children? Like, genuinely, what does a kid make of this, Maybe a kid gets it. Maybe I'm just too dense because I'm a grown-up with no imagination anymore. She went back out through the world gate and back out through Roshaun's place in that virtual time heart and back out to the railing. Virtual time heart. So it's not an in-between place, really? Or it is an in-between place because it's virtual? That second one feels more right. I don't know. Dairine stepped back out of it all, across the plane of wizardry, and back through the portals of dream to Earth's universe, to the real world, to begin the search for the one who was lost. And then Nita, who is in that backyard, watches her and nods to herself and steps back into her own dream. And has a little bit of a tete-a-tete with the lone one, who basically is trying to be like, I mean, you sort of won, but like not really. And Nita is like, oh, come on. We won. I know you're trying to act like you still got something out of this. And like, maybe you did a little, but you're acting like actually you got one over on us. And you didn't. Sweetie, stop. You're embarrassing yourself. It was pretty funny, honestly. And this is when she asks the Paradexis, because the lone one says, wizards may always be here, but will you? Nita shook her head. Well, she said to the Paradexis, will I? Let's go find out, it said. So the Paradexis is there in her dreams, but not when she's awake, I guess. Why? I So then we go to Kit. And this was done so well. It's just Kit going through his morning. And every step of... I'm getting choked up. Every step of the way through his ordinary getting ready for his day, there are multiple moments of Ponch should be here. Ponch should be laying there. Ponch should be reacting this way. Ponch should be asking for this. Ponch should be doing that. And this incredible grief and him suddenly having a moment of really understanding more what Nita has been going through losing her mother. And that one for me, I appreciated because your friends love you and care about you. But that doesn't mean that they're going to really understand necessarily when you're going through a really huge loss. And Kit meant well and tried his best to handle her deep grief and pulling out of the world. And really was trying to be respectful of that. But he clearly just didn't really understand. And how could you? And granted, this isn't a parent. It's a pet. So it's not still going to be quite the same. But the connection that he had to Ponch was so distinct and so real, you know? And I just really liked the sort of methodical nature of him having to do every ordinary thing and noticing this empty spot where Ponch had been. And I don't know what's going on, but the past year, I have seen more friends lose their pets. I don't know what's going on, if it's just a coincidence that it seems to be all happening at once. But I am not kidding you. Last week, 3 separate friends of mine had to put their dogs down. I don't know what the fuck, but it just feels really relevant right now, this moment, because pets are just a different thing. You know, they depend on you. They're always there. The whole like relationship feels so much, there's almost like a purity to it that you don't have with human beings, because there aren't the complexities of like misunderstandings and stuff getting in the way of a connection. So the grief from losing a pet is like its own thing. And he walks by Tinkerbell outside because he's got Ponch's leash, even though he's like, what am I doing? And Tinkerbell just looks at him, but doesn't like act the way he normally did. Walks away. And he looks up and he sees a sheepdog. It had been sitting on the lawn weeks ago, and it wasn't a neighborhood dog. Kit's father had asked him where it had come from, and Kit had had no idea. His first urge was to turn away. The sight of any dog was a touch on an open wound. Then he stopped himself. I don't care, Kit thought. I want to talk to a dog, any dog, and get an answer back. The sheepdog crossed the street toward him, jumped up on the sidewalk, and paused by him looking up. Kit almost managed to laugh. The way its hair hung down in its face, it was amazing it could see anything. He hunkered down next to it and ruffled it behind the ears, though the gesture made his throat go thick with tears. In the speech, he said, So listen, guy, just where did you come from? The sheepdog shook its fur out of its eyes and gazed up at him, its tongue hanging out. That's sort of a funny question, it said. You should know, you were there too. And Kit's breath went right out of him, because though the sheepdog's eyes were golden and not dark, Ponch was looking out of them. But I thought that you... That me did, said the sheepdog. But there's a lot more of me now. I'm more here than I ever was. I'm in every dog there is. Didn't I tell you I wasn't going to leave you? Some parts of the old choice were worth keeping, but I made another choice for all of us. And now we have a new story. how the hound of heaven defeated the wolf that ate the moon, but only with the help of the wise one who knew that what you give away, you get back 100 times more, and who brought the hound to where he could learn how the sacrifice could be made. Now all debts are paid, and we can all be more than we were. And suddenly the street was full of squirrels, sitting upright on their haunches and looking expectantly at the sheepdog. At least most of the time. The sheepdog started wriggling wildly in Kit's arms and washing his face like crazy. Laughing, Kit opened his arms, and the sheepdog went lolloping off after the squirrels, barking his head off, tearing down the road and out of sight. One after another, all the dogs living up and down the street started to bark. With the tears running down his face and grinning, Kit turned back toward his house to get his things. As he did, he saw someone standing at the end of his driveway watching him as if she'd known exactly where he'd be. Laughing, he ran to meet her. Is that Nita? Or is that somebody else? I wasn't sure how to take that. I don't know. But that was a delightful ending. I am very happy about this. So I'm like, he ran away and was chasing squirrels, but is he going to is this sheepdog going to live with Kit now? Is he going to have a paunchy back? Really? I hope. April says, I thought it was Nita. Okay, cool. I thought, but I was like, is there somebody I'm forgetting that's a she that's super significant that would turn up like that? I'm over time because I went on a tangent about homelessness. Jacob, an overall thoughts about the series so far. I am just super impressed with the subtlety and nuance of all of these stories and the way that she engages with the pain of things and the real conflicting emotions that happen, even when you know what the right thing to do is, or think you don't, just there is something so respectful about her writing YA books and trusting that kids are going to get this, and they may not, but it doesn't matter. Eventually they will. And this is still valuable. I just really appreciate it whenever adults trust that kids can handle the complexity of conflicting emotions in stories. What situations would you like to see each of our heroes face? That's one of those things that I really don't even know how to answer that, because I don't want to see them facing any more obstacles. I just want to see them I talked about this when we were in that part of the, I think, previous book, or was it the beginning of this book? God, you guys know it's been such a time that I'm losing track, but Nita and Kit were working on a spell together to try and clean the water in, I don't remember if it was the bay. It was somewhere where it was very polluted. And I would love a book just about them going around and doing things like that. I am very into the idea of using magic to improve the planet and people's lives in a more big picture way, but practical versus a just sort of save the world in general. Saving the world in general has its place, and I have no problem with that. But it feels a lot harder to relate to than the immediate problems that we're facing just as a species on planet Earth. And that is something I would love to see more of, because it's that's actually something personally I'm working on, a silly witch mystery book. And that's something that I'm planning to have her do, is a lot more assistive magic, I guess is kind of the word I want, where she helps with infrastructure stuff here and there and just generally tries to keep things from being damaging. And it's just something that I am sure that there are books out there that explore that more, but I always sort of run across it as a side quest. And the main quest is something a lot with like higher stakes. And Yama says, I want them to rest. That was like my initial thought, really. And this would be something that would be kind of restful. It would be like they're working on it, but it isn't pressing. There's nobody's lives at stake immediately. And it's something that they can just do to like feel good and like they're nourishing themselves in a way with just these simple tasks. And there's a subplot in the show The Magicians that I cover for Spoil Me, where a woman just fixed the like lead pipe system in this town. It was like a Flint, Michigan situation. And she had magic and she just took the lead out of the water. And this woman, her story was fucking compelling. And she just like kind of disappeared. And I was like, what the hell? That was so interesting. And I was super bummed by that because that's the shit I'm like, wouldn't that be amazing? You know? So I want just like some sort of getting to live out a fantasy of magically waving a wand and being able to fix certain problems that feel very fixable if people who were in charge felt like fucking doing it. I'm going to go off on another tangent. I can't. I'm too over time. But thank you guys all so much for coming and listening to this. Mordecai is also here, Yama, April, and Jacob, who came beforehand. Thank you, Yama, for commissioning this final episode. I hope that y'all will keep an eye on Discord for when I hopefully start reading or listening to the audiobooks. Let's see, the next one, Wizard of Mars and Games Wizards Play. And then it says interstitial works in the Young Wizards universe. Interim errantry, including the novel Young Wizards, Lifeboats. Interim errantry 2, On Ordeal. And then the Feline Wizards sequence, The Book of Night with Moon, To Visit the Queen, The Big Meow. I'm sorry, what? The Big Meow? Okay. I'm going to have to. I have to. All right. Keep an eye on the Discord. Thank you guys again. Toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.